Good morning. What a morning, huh?
Yep.
First of all, I am not going to read those scriptures. In the interest of time, they're all the two greatest commandments, which I hope you all know. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's kind of the context of what I'll be speaking about this morning. I'm also going to ask you I'm going to ask to apologize for reading most of this because it's really, really easy, especially on this topic, for me to go down some rabbit hole to some wonderland. And you soon will be asking, what's my point? As will I. So I'm going to semi-read it and hopefully we'll get through this. And it's a story that I've wanted to share with you all for a number of years. And I'm hoping that it's an encouragement to you. So my story starts when I'm in my mid-50s, and three events caused me to reevaluate how I express my Christianity. The first one was Howie Rich's preaching, and for those of you who don't know, Howie Rich was our pastor here for about 10 years. I would describe his preaching as authentic. I never felt like Howie was preaching to us in the congregation. He was always preaching to himself, and we happened to get to listen in. He was both pragmatic and mystical. He gave me something practical to think about or to do every week, but he also introduced me to a lot of Christian traditions that growing up Baptist would have been considered sins. Things like meditation, icons, rituals, this meditative approach to reading the Bible called Lectio Divina. But most importantly, Howie convinced me that if God is nothing else, God and love are synonyms, and God is always present, even when we're absent. The second event is that I changed the way I read the Bible. I've always been an avid Bible reader, but I was more of a prescriptive reader. I was looking for rules and clues so I could form my airtight theology. I mostly read the epistles because they were directed at the church. But I had this moment where I decided that if I called myself a Christian, maybe I should be focusing on what Jesus said. And I began to only read the Gospels in a quasi-Lectio Divina style, which means that I just read the passage, sat with it, didn't try to understand it, and just waited. So I started at Matthew 1. I went through Acts because I always felt like Acts was part of Luke. And then I'd start over back in Matthew. I did this for several years. I read the Gospels as stories, as a narrative, and I just let it stew in my subconscious. I didn't do anything else with it. And then the third event that happened to me is I started attending AA meetings. And by the grace of God, I don't have a substance abuse problem, but my daughter was a heroin addict at the time. And I was talking to her one day when she was, actively using, and I said, I don't get addiction, because I truly didn't. And she immediately responded and said, you ought to go to an AA meeting. And I said, that's the best damn idea you've had in 10 years. I'll see you there on Saturday. So at that time, I was working really long hours. I was traveling extensively. I basically wasn't home during the week. So that Saturday morning, I went down to the Baptist church down by the bowling alley in downtown Gloucester, walked through that door and almost got knocked over by this overwhelming sense of love and acceptance. And honestly, I've never felt that before, and I haven't felt it since. There was no greeter, but I saw a line of people in front of the coffee urn, so I got my styrofoam cup, got a cup of really bad coffee, and as they say in AA, claimed my seat. And I sat down and I listened for an hour. And what I heard was Jesus's teachings without all the Christian dogma and the Christian language. and I was completely hooked. And I attended the next 2.5 years virtually every Saturday and Sunday. I may have missed 1 or 2 days. And I did a deep dive into AA because I was curious, how did they get it? You know, they were proclaiming what Jesus said without saying that. And I found out that the 2 founders of AA were part of a Christian movement that started back in the 1920s called the Oxford Group. And the leader of the Oxford Group believed that fear and selfishness were the root of all problems, and that Jesus' teachings on how we should live was the solution. And so I developed a deep respect for AA literature, its principles and its polity. Their literature reflects a very deep understanding of human nature. Their decentralized local autonomy is something, of course, that fits in with us Congregationalists quite well. And their strategy to stay sober consisted of humility, love, and service. And something else that Jesus also talked a lot about. So when I started to attend AA meetings, finally, all that reading that I had done for the last couple of years, a few themes started to come through for me. The first one was Jesus spent very little time talking about the afterlife. He spent a lot of time modeling and talking about how to live this life. And his focus was on attitude. It wasn't really on beliefs or acts. He also spent a lot of time correcting the Pharisees, who were the established religion of his day. And I realized I was a current day Pharisee. You know, I was a part of the established religion. My focus was on personal piety. My focus was on believing the right doctrines and theology. And my focus was on defending God from infidels and bad theology. But most importantly, what I came to realize is the summation of all Jesus' teachings were the 2 greatest commandments: to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And why do I think this is the summation? Because Jesus said it. He said, all the law and prophets hang on these 2 commandments. I decided that all Scripture needed to be viewed through this lens of loving God and loving your neighbor. So these 3 events, Howie's preaching, my Bible reading, and attending AA, along with these themes of the Gospels, coalesced into a desire to follow Jesus' teachings with less emphasis on being a Christian, if you understand what I mean by it when I say that. So I had complicated Christianity to the point of being comfortably numb, and I needed to get back to, as AA puts it, first things first and keep it simple. Okay, now what do I do? How do I reorient my focus? How do I keep first things first? How do I keep it simple? Well, there's been a lot of advancement in neuroscience in the past 20 years, and an awful lot of podcasts for the masses have been spawned because of that, and I've listened to a lot of them. And the plasticity of our brains, that is our ability to make new neural pathways, has been well documented. And just maybe I have some agency to make the attitudinal changes I need by focusing on these 2 greatest commandments. And if I'm lucky, I might even obey them some of the time. Maybe that might change my behavior, and the rest of just Jesus' teachings on how to live will just fall into place. And I realized focusing on these 2 greatest commandments would be a lifelong journey, and I'd never get to the destination. But regardless, I needed a map to keep me from getting lost. And I was thinking about the 12 steps of AA. That's their map. And I decided to riff off of that But instead of the goal of sobriety, my map would try to produce the attitudes, habits, and behaviors so I could align to these two greatest commandments. My map was designed to be a program to train my brain and hopefully be able to change these things. And I didn't want the map to use the term steps because it kind of implies a progression or degression. You're either going up or down. And based on what neuroscience tells us about how good and bad habits develop and how one changes habits, I wanted to use the term habit, but I didn't actually have that yet, so I couldn't use that. And then I struggled mightily to create this map. When I'm trying to figure something out, I write, and I ended up writing this 16,000 word manifesto. And when I finally got to the end of that, it allowed me to kind of figure out exactly what that process would be so that I could follow those two greatest commandments. So I settled on the term practices. For these 8 statements, I created 8 statements to remind me that this is a training program that requires a beginner's mind. Doesn't matter how long I'm doing it. And I'm not going to talk anymore about the 8 practices, but if you're curious, I can share them with you. So for the next 3 years, I did my best to work these 8 practices, and I think I made some progress, but honestly, it was only really noticeable to me. And then a 4th event happened. The unexpected sudden rupture of a relationship that broke down all my self-defenses and left me bereft. And my ego, and by ego I don't mean Freudian ego, I kind of mean, that our sense of self and that voice that's rattling in your head all the time. My ego told me that I had been wronged. I was a victim, and I needed to take vengeance and seek vindication. Pretty natural response. But that voice was quickly followed by another that asked, what about your 8 practices? What have you learned these past 3 years? And what I had learned was, number 1, to ask for help. Be grateful. Listen more, speak less. Never judge, including myself. Be kind to all, including myself. Employ rigorous honesty on myself. That's a term that's used in AA, rigorous honesty, and I love it. Always lead with love. Be compassionate and forgive. And I realized I had to make a choice between what comes naturally to me and what Jesus taught is a better way to live in this situation that I was faced with. I had to make a choice about turning my beliefs, that is my intellectual and emotional convictions, into faith. And what faith for me is trust in action. It's actually moving on what you believe. And my ego wanted to do the exact opposite. So I took that leap, and I made my 8 practices my faith. I applied them to this situation, and guess what happened? Nothing. Nothing happened. For 2 years, that relationship remained broken. Every day, I willfully followed the 8 practices, but my ego's narrative about the relationship controlled my attitude. So I remained the victim, and all I could think about was vengeance and vindication. The irony was my narrative began as the truth because it was the actual words that were said. But after 2 years passed, my narrative had become fiction because the relationship was mending. Trust and honesty were returning, and the words in my narrative just no longer described that relationship. But I couldn't acknowledge it. I couldn't let go of it. My ego loved it, and so did I. The reality was my relationship had healed, but I hadn't. By the time an additional 2 years of suffering had transpired, I intellectually knew my narrative was killing me, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. I was incapable of revising it, and it had complete control of my life. And after attending 2.5 years of, AA meetings, I know what addiction is. I had it. I was powerless to change my narrative. Despite trying a lot of modalities those 4 years, nothing worked. And I was truly desperate at that point. And that's a state AA calls a gift. A short time after I came to this state of desperation, I awoke with the familiar tapes running in my head as they always had, except there was one difference. I wasn't paying attention. I didn't care. The narrative suddenly had no power over me. The tapes continued to play, but I'd been released from its grip. I have no explanation for this, other than it was a miracle. Working those 8 practices for those 4 years was essential in feeling God's presence and conscientiously being loving and kind, but it took a miracle to get emotionally disconnected from my narrative. No amount of self-will or therapy brought me to that peace that passes understanding that Jesus promises. God had done for me what I could not do for myself. Well, that's my story. I could have spared you the last quarter hour by simply summarizing what I've learned these last 15 years. God is omnipotent. Love is omnipotent. They're synonyms. God is always present. Stay humble and ask for help. Be persistent but patient. Focus on the 2 greatest commandments and the rest will take care of itself. And most importantly for me, don't believe everything I think, especially those ego-driven narratives. In closing, I want to read a quote from a 2011 movie by Terrence Malick called The Tree of Life. This quote, frankly, smacks of dualism. That's a construct that I don't really find useful because very few of us are in an either-or situation, which is what dualism is, really. But regardless, I love the descriptions because they capture the essence of 2 ways of living. And so this is what one of the characters says in the movie. There are 2 ways through life, the way of nature and the way of grace. You have to choose which one you'll follow. I'm trying to breathe. Nature only wants to please itself, get others to please it too, likes to lord it over them, to have its own way, to find reasons to be unhappy when all the world is shining around it, when love is smiling through all things. Grace doesn't try to please itself, accepts being slighted, forgotten, disliked, accepts insults and injuries, No one who loves the way of grace ever comes to a bad end. Grace helps each other and loves everyone and everything, every leaf, every ray of light. Grace forgives. With God's help, may all of us continue to choose the way of grace. Thanks.